Hi, I'm Abby.
I'm Amy.
And I'm Emma. You're listening to a clip from the Read It Forward podcast. And if you'd like to hear more, you can find us at readitforward.com/podcast or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Enjoy.
Your book, House of Nutter, centers on the Nutter brothers, and they experienced a slice of history that was unlike any other. So tell us a little bit about what your book sort of uncovers about these two men.
Right. So Tommy and David Nutter were born just before and during World War II in Britain, in London and also in Wales. And they grew up in the 50s, which was very, very sort of austerity-orientated time in Britain. And then they kind of came of age in swinging London in the famous swinging 60s. And that was a time when there was a lot of upward mobility, and they really kind of harnessed their own creativity as a way of sort of pulling themselves out of this working class background that they had been born into. And in the process of doing that, Tommy becomes a quite well-known tailor on Savile Row, and then a very famous tailor on Savile Row. And Savile Row is basically the center of bespoke. It's where you go to get measured up for your suits. And he starts dressing, the Beatles and Mick Jagger and Elton John and Diana Ross. And his brother David, who's slightly older, becomes a rock photographer and actually starts photographing a lot of these same people and photographs Elton John and Yoko in really unusual circumstances. The book follows both of them throughout their lives and over sort of the course of 5 decades. And by following them, it also actually tells the story of these 5 decades of history, and particularly 5 decades of queer history, because they're both gay. And so it's quite a surprising take on things. I think a lot of stories that people think they know about these people, and it kind of tells it from a different angle. But then it also sort of shows exactly how much happened to gay people in 5 decades. It was pretty extraordinary.
Completely. Yeah.
Yeah.
You wrote that Tommy Nutter was unashamedly gay at a moment in time when being so could get you ostracized, if not worse. Where do you think his courage to be himself came from, at a time when so many were hiding who they really were?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think there were three things that went into making him willing to express himself. And the first is simply him. I mean, some people are irrepressible. Some people can't be contained by the boundaries that society places on them. And Quentin Crisp is a very famous example of that before. So partly it was just him, it was just this particular person, and partly the era and the age that he was a teenager at this moment, when all of these kids were being incredibly creative and feeling emboldened to express themselves in ways that maybe transgressed gender boundaries a little bit. So you had young men, even young straight men, wearing colored pants that, even a few years before that would have coded as gay, as queer to a lot of people, and these people, they're walking around like nothing.
Yeah.
So I think it was a moment in time when he felt that he could do that. And I think the other thing is David, and the fact that he had this ally at home. They were both gay, and I think that would have certainly made him more comfortable with himself. It's worth pointing out, though, that it's not like he was just walking around with a neon sign saying he was gay. His parents didn't know for decades. He definitely took extensive measures to conceal it from them. So I think he was selective, but he didn't really make much of an effort to disguise it from the larger world anyway.
Yeah, and he found himself in a community of, sometimes like-minded people who were embracing this freedom. So where did you get the idea to write this book? Like, what was the first seed that sort of implanted itself in your brain?
Yeah, it's funny because like someone the other day called me a fashion writer, and I'm like, I'm not a fashion writer at all. I usually write about like wolves in the West or something. Like I'm much more of like like an outdoor adventure writer. So it's strange that I would write this book, but the reason I did is because I don't have a beat really. I tend to kind of want to write about the things that intuitively interest me. And when I start on a project, I don't always necessarily understand why I'm writing about something. And it's through the writing process that I work out why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So the original seed was a very good friend of mine told me a story once about this man named Tommy Nutter, who was quite a well-known tailor in London and went to an opening of an Andy Warhol exhibition in the Tate Gallery in London and was denied access because he didn't have a ticket. So his response was to run across the road and throw himself into the Thames. And I thought that was a bit of an unusual overreaction.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I did some reading, and the more I read about him, the more I became intrigued. And then I realized at a certain point that his life mapped in a really unusual way onto the contours of queer history for 50 years. And I thought it might be an interesting way of telling that story through this one man. And you'll note that I haven't mentioned David because I didn't know he existed.
Right.
And I met him in New York. I found him on LinkedIn of all places. Thanks, LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And I arranged to have coffee with him, and he turns up wearing this crumpled Rolling Stones t-shirt. And I think my original notes from that meeting, I say, is David going to be a problem? ? Because he struck me as really eccentric and maybe a little unhinged. And I say that with love now because of course he wasn't unhinged. He was telling the truth about everything. It was only gradually that I realized the story I was telling was twice the size that I thought it was, and it was actually about two people. So it was very intuitive, the whole process.
Right, because in your research, David was just meant to add some color about his brother and an interview subject, and
He was
then
meant to be a
suddenly,
source. He wasn't meant to be half the book.
Right. Well, I can't now imagine this book without the two, sort of dueling stories. They're inextricably linked. They inform one another. To have these two queer brothers who grew up at such a momentous moment in history, what a find. I mean,
you tell me.
But I bet your heart stopped when you realized this is going to be a bigger book.
It did a little bit, but I was so excited about how it was going to be a bigger book and the scope of it and how wonderful he was, and that he was right there with me the whole way and telling me his story. And so I felt like if I was worried about anything, it was the reaction of the publisher when I called them up and said, hey, this book that we was that size? Well, actually, maybe it's like 30,000 words more. Is that okay? I was a little more worried about that than I was about, more work or anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you hope, as people start to read this book, what do you hope they take away from it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I feel like everyone's going to take something different because it does sort of cross so much ground. For me, the thing that was the most surprising and the thing that stayed with me long after I finished this was the idea. I think we have this sense that the AIDS crisis ended and we moved on and it was awful what happened, but it ended. And I learned talking to David that for some people it never ended.
Right. And
some people live with the fallout of what happened every day. And they are like ghosts in this city in New York, walking around, sitting on the subway, these sort of faces that you look at and maybe don't think about. And they're carrying this incredible trauma around. And David lost everyone. Mm-hmm. So I would want people to kind of take away an understanding that, AIDS never really ended for some people, and that the loss there is still with us, and some people directly with them, they lost people, but with all of us in the sense that these incredible, creative, exciting people were cut down before they were done. Tommy was 49 when he died, and God knows what he would have gone on to do. We'll never know, and it's appalling that what happened mm-hmm. and was allowed to happen for so long. You don't go into a book about a tailor on Savile Row expecting to be confronted with these big existential questions and sort of lingering questions of trauma. Mm-hmm. It was unexpected and difficult, but important. And I'm really glad that the book was elastic enough that it could stretch to encompass that and end in that place with a story that I think is much more important than maybe you would think just by, hearing Tailor on Savile Row. Mm.
Well, that's what makes this book so incredible. So thank you so much, Lance Richardson, author of House of Nutter, available now. Go pick it up. It's an amazing story.
Thanks very much.